Alright, this is the view of the nervous system. Looking at, let's see, I'm going to get us to the regular view here. So, the nervous system is made up of two components, the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system is made up of the brain and the spinal cord. So that's what's highlighted in green there. And then in yellow purple is the peripheral nervous system, which includes the nerves. And remember from from lab this week, we saw that there are nerves that go directly from the brain, which are called the cranial nerves. So the peripheral nervous system is made up of nerves. The central nervous system is made up of the brain and spinal cord. When we look at the functions of the nervous system, it is necessary to perceive different inputs from the environment. So we have our specialized neurons that are specialized to detect light, sound, temperature, different smells, taste, a variety of external inputs coming into the body are perceived by sensory receptors. And then we take that information and we process it within the brain, and that stimulates a response from the nervous system to the environment. Also, mental activities, when you're studying material for a test, when you're thinking about past experiences, perceiving a situation in your own unique way, that's all at the level of the brain. And when we stimulate muscle movement, that is information that's leaving the central nervous system and activating muscles. And then when we look at secretions of glands, that's where we see the nervous system and the endocrine system interact, as glands are stimulated to secrete their hormone under the input of information from the nervous system. So again, the two major subdivisions of the nervous system are the central nervous system, consisting of the brain and spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system, consisting of the nerves. So looking at the central nervous system, this is where information is processed. So nerves bring information to the brain and spinal cord, and they also carry information from the brain and spinal cord. Notice that the spinal cord and the brain come together after that spinal cord passes through the foramen magnum. So there is no real separation in tissue-wise between the spinal cord and the base of the brainstem. They simply flow into one another. So when we look at information coming into the nervous system, we have information coming and going again through the nerves, through the peripheral nervous system. So if we talk about information coming into the nervous system, we refer to that as sensory information. So here's a cross-section of the spinal cord. Here's a nerve cell that is extending from the periphery, from the end of the nerve, specialized as a sensory receptor, to the central nervous system. So we have information coming in through a sensory receptor, traveling in through the nerve into the spinal cord to be processed. So we call this pathway coming into the central nervous system, this is the sensory or afferent pathway. And notice that it comes in through a common pathway here outside in the nerve, but then it divides when it gets near the spinal cord into this what's called the dorsal root. And we'll talk about that in more detail in lab. But for now, just know that there is an incoming pathway, and the name of that pathway is the sensory or afferent pathway. Then as the nervous system, the brain or spinal cord, determines an appropriate response for that information coming in, the information leaving the brain or spinal cord is called the motor response. Motor just means we're referring to information leaving the spinal cord and going out to a gland, skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, or smooth muscle. So it could be a variety of different end points for this information leaving the central nervous system, and we determine what gland or what structure is involved depending on the response needed in the body. So for example, an autonomic nervous system response would be anything that goes to a cardiac muscle cell, smooth muscle cell, or glandular cell, because those are not under voluntary control. So in this case, we can see information here is going to the large intestine. That's smooth muscle, not under our control, so that would be an example of an autonomic motor response. In this case, we see the neuron traveling carrying information going to a skeletal muscle which is under our control. So we call that a somatic motor response. So somatic, you should know, is voluntary skeletal muscle, and autonomic is information going to involuntary structures such as smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. And there are two types of autonomic response, sympathetic or parasympathetic. And sympathetic is usually the fight or flight or stress response. So if we're looking at the heart, for example, we would see that autonomic motor response would cause heart rate to increase, where if it was carrying parasympathetic, if it was a parasympathetic autonomic neuron, that would cause heart rate to decrease. So this is a nice chart that summarizes how the nervous system is organized. We have information coming into the nervous system as its stimulus, and that stimulus is received by the body through sensory receptors. So the sensory division of the peripheral nervous system carries information from that stimulus. So in this case it would be visual stimuli through the eyes coming into the nerve, the optic nerve, into the brain to be processed. So the brain processes that information and determines what type of information, if it should be responded to or not. In this case, if you were seeing a bear out in the woods and you were not in a zoo, you would probably be concerned, and it would definitely need and require a response to get you out of that dangerous situation. So in this case, the response going through the motor pathway would be, again, it's the response from the central nervous system. It would go both directions. One, it would activate somatic motor neurons that would stimulate skeletal muscle to get you to run away and leave the dangerous situation. And it also stimulate autonomic motor neurons to activate your heart muscle, to get your heart muscle increasing in its rhythm. So you would have an increased heart rate. You would have smooth muscle dilating in your airways to allow you to breathe better as you're running away. And glands would secrete hormones such as, for example, if we need to supply blood sugar or sugar to our working muscles, we would want to make sure that we activate glands that would raise blood sugar. In this case, it would be the pancreas secreting glucagon, but other glands would be secreting their hormones as well, but we won't get into the details of that until you get into the endocrine system, which is more discussed in more detail in advanced A&P. But you can see how the different divisions work together. The peripheral nervous system brings information in, the central nervous system processes it, and then the information going out goes through the peripheral nervous system again, but there's different neurons carrying information out compared to those coming in. Again, the neurons carrying information in, we call those sensory afferent neurons, and information going out, we call those motor neurons. Some of them may be autonomic, some of them may be somatic. So if we look at a typical neuron, which we did in lab, so I'm going to review this just real quickly here, we see the receiving end. These are where we would find sensory receptors for specific stimuli, light, sound, temperature, pressure, touch. These are the dendrites. Dendrites receive information into a neuron, so it's incoming information. Then the cell body is the large portion here, which contains lots of different organelles. That processes that information and determines if it's worth passing along to the first part of the axon, which is called the axon hillock. And we're going to find out later in lecture about the importance of the axon hillock, because that's where a special electrical signal called the action potential is generated. Once that electrical stimulus is generated and passed along, it travels down this long, thin, narrow region of the neuron called the axon. Many of the axons in our nerves are insulated with this special fatty material called myelin, and that insulates the neuron, and it has special areas along the axon where there is no myelin called the node of Ranvier, where the impulse can jump from node to node to node, making for a speedier transmission of that impulse down the axon. So it's almost like if you were trying to, jump across a stream or a small pond. If there were rocks there, it'd be faster to hop from rock to rock across rather than going straight through the water. So it's the same thing along an axon. We find the electrical impulse goes from node to node to node, and that speeds transmission. And then at the end of the neuron are these axon terminals, and in some neurons there are special neurotransmitters stored in vesicles in the axon terminals that it will release those neurotransmitters in order to stimulate another neuron or a cell, a muscle cell or a gland cell, to get that gland or cell to respond and use that impulse to elicit a response from the body. So this is a nerve cell called a neuron. These do not undergo mitosis after we're done growing, so once we have developed our nerve cells, our neurons, they are not considered a regenerating cell. Now if you ruin or damage a portion of an axon of a neuron, we can see it regenerate and repair that. But if we destroy an entire neuron, it's very difficult and impossible actually to replace that neuron. But there is a lot of research in this area occurring, so we do find that we are able to recover from damage to neurons better than we had first anticipated, and there's several different explanations for that, but we won't get into that in class. So there is some research to support ways that we accommodate and adjust to repair. For example, if you know anyone who's had a stroke, for example, who may have damaged certain parts of the brain, they can, with really good rehabilitation, recover and gain some skills back that they may have lost as a result of that stroke. There's special cells associated with nervous tissue that do not conduct electrical impulses, and they can undergo mitosis, and these are called the neuroglia. Think of them as neuron glue in the sense that they nourish and support neurons. That's their role. So the four neuroglia that you have to know: one is the astrocyte. The astrocyte is found in nervous tissue, and it has special foot processes that wrap around the capillaries of in nervous tissue that protect nervous tissue from what's in the blood leaking into nervous tissue. For example, if you have a bacterial infection, say a bad case of food poisoning or a urinary tract infection, we would not want that bacteria leaking into the nervous tissue in the brain or spinal cord. So these astrocytes provide a protective mechanism to prevent things from going from the blood, the general blood supply, into nervous tissue. So for example, we call this the blood-brain barrier because it protects the nervous tissue, because the nervous tissue is so important for the general functioning of the body. Now we do find, if you've ever taken care of elderly patients, that if they have a urinary tract infection, they can act so unusual that some people think they have Alzheimer's or dementia, when actually it's just a urinary tract infection that has caused inflammation in the brain. So we do see when people have a system-wide infection of the urinary tract, especially in the elderly, it can affect brain functioning due to inflammation in the brain. And once you treat that urinary tract infection, typically they are back to normal again, and they don't even remember how unusual they were acting while they had the urinary tract infection. Another special neuroglial cell in the central nervous system are the ependymal cells. Notice that they are ciliated, they have cilia, and these, with the help of special capillaries in the nervous tissue, secrete cerebral spinal fluid, and that's what bathes our nervous tissue, nourishes the neurons, and is important for protection and cushion of the brain. Our brain essentially floats in cerebral spinal fluid, and that provides protection to the brain as well. So there's cilia to help transport that and circulate that cerebral spinal fluid throughout the ventricles of the brain. The last two cells, these both secrete myelin. The oligodendrocyte is a myelin producing cell in the central nervous system, so we find these only in the brain and spinal cord. And the Schwann cell produces myelin only in the peripheral nervous system, so we find these in around axons in the nerves. So the Schwann cells are in the peripheral nervous system, oligodendrocytes are in the central nervous system. Both secrete myelin, both insulate axons to speed transmission of electrical impulses. So if we look at the oligodendrocyte, oligo means many, so here we can see more than one axon is myelinated by a single oligodendrocyte, where the Schwann cell only myelinates a portion of an axon in a nerve. So this is much more short acting in terms of where it produces its myelin. It's more isolated on the axon compared to oligodendrocytes that can myelinate more than one. So if we look at the purpose of myelinated axons and unmyelinated axons, wherever we want speed of transmission, a high speed of transmission, we're going to find myelinated axons. So we get a rapid response from the body due to the impulse going from the sensory receptor to the brain and out through the motor neuron. We see rapid transmission and myelinated axons. But we may not want rapid transmission in the body in axons where we see gland secretion being important, or the digestive tract. For example, moving food through the digestive tract. We wouldn't want that to be a rapid response and action, because that would result in us having to race to the bathroom as a result of that muscle responding so quickly to that nervous input. So as a result, unmyelinated axons serve a valuable role in having a slower, more prolonged response, and that is important in the digestive tract and in gland secretion. So that brings us to electrical signals. These are the actual impulses that the nervous system generates and transmits from one part of the body to the other. And when we talk about electrical signals, we're talking about ion concentration differences across the membrane of a neuron or some other cell that can respond to an impulse, such as muscle cells. So we're going to talk in quite a bit of detail about how this occurs. The key player in establishing a difference in ion concentration is the sodium-potassium pump. If you recall, when we talked about active transport, we looked at how the sodium-potassium pump will take 2 potassium ions from outside the cell and transport them into the cell. At the same time, in the next cycle, it'll take 3 sodium ions from inside the cell and transport them outside the cell. So the sodium-potassium pump is a key player in how the sodium and potassium ions are distributed across the membrane. And recall that this pump requires ATP because you're pumping these ions against their concentration gradient. So without ATP, the sodium-potassium pump would not function. So it does require energy. So at this point we will stop, and I'll continue with the notes on the nervous system in part 2.